The most important and impressive thing in this monastery is the chapel of Jampa, Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. An entire building houses the world's largest gilded statue, a 26-meter-high image of the future Buddha. Made in 1914 under the 9th Panchen Lama, it took some 900 artisans and laborers 4 years for its completion. The statue is serene-looking and quite impressive. More than 300 kilograms of gold has been used to coat it. The surrounding walls are gold paintings of Buddha. Then there is Victory Chapel, the tomb of the 10th Panchen Lama, who died in 1989, and the tomb of the 4th Panchen Lama, Kelsang Liengrer. The Tashilhunpo became the seat of an important Lama lineage, the Panchen Lamas. Panchen Lama, what was that? Panchen means great scholar, and the title was bestowed on the abbots of Tashilhunpo. But though Panchen Lama was considered second to the Dalai Lama, rivalries emerged in the Gelugpa order, and the Chinese started declaring themselves Panchen Lamas. That the 10th Panchen Lama never escaped Chinese clutches and was largely kept in Beijing, only occasionally visiting Tashilhunpo. In 1978, after being released from jail, where he stayed for 14 years, suffering abuse and torture, he rarely spoke in outright defiance of the Chinese authorities. But before his death, he again fell out with the Chinese, arguing at a high level, meeting in Beijing, that Chinese occupation had brought nothing but misery and hardship to his people. He returned to Tashilhunpo Monastery in 1989 to attend some function and died there after 4 days, as he had predicted earlier that he would die on Tibetan soil. In 1995, the Dalai Lama identified Gedun Choki Myanmar, a 6-year-old boy from Amdo, as the reincarnation of the Panchen Lama. Within a month, the boy had been taken away to Beijing, and now this 11th Panchen Lama is under house arrest at an undisclosed location in China, causing him to be dubbed as the youngest political prisoner. Chaldrel Rinpoche, who identified this boy, was also arrested. The Chinese nominated a boy, Gyanke Norbu, son of a Communist Party member, as the 11th Panchen Lama to control his education and use him further to identify the next Dalai Lama. Tashilhunpo Monastery. Now this monastery is essentially a walled town in its own right. You can see the busy cobbled lanes twisting around the ancient buildings. Many of the chapels have been locked for renovations, and small pieces of cloth to be used as flags. One can't be sure whether all the monks are the genuine ones, because the Chinese have also kept some people there dressed as monks, as to know what happens there all the time. Shigatse Zong. No, very little remains of this fort now. It was destroyed in the popular uprising of 1959. There is a courtyard in the center where monks can be seen debating. Even policemen can be seen here. And so the atmosphere of such a monastery can be anticipated. On the 1st of September 1965, the TAR, Tibetan Autonomous Region, was brought into being formally, with much fanfare and talk of happy Tibetans fighting back tears of gratitude at becoming one with the great motherland. The tears were said to keep coming, and to tell you the truth, the tears had come always to flow. In China also, trouble was brewing in the form of a social movement there that came to be known as the Cultural Revolution. This cultural revolution shook China to its core, trampled all traditions underfoot, caused countless deaths, and gave running of the country over to the mobs of Red Guards. All of China suffered in Mao's bold experiment to create a new socialist paradise, but Tibet suffered the most. The first Red Guards arrived in Lhasa in July 1966. In the spirit of destroying the four olds, old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, they destroyed virtually everything that could be destroyed, animate as well as inanimate. The mantra, "Long live Chairman Mao," was given instead of Om Mani Padme Hum. The Buddha was called a reactionary. The Cultural Revolution saw the destruction of the former Tibetan ruling elite. Their class background made them enemies of the people, whether they had supported the Chinese or not. Tibetan aristocrats who had obtained high-ranking posts in the government were dismissed and sent to labor camps. Almost all areas of Tibet had their own local oracles and diviners, and the Chinese began to subject them to public criticism. Diviners were paraded at mass meetings and forced to confess at performing tricks and admit that they did not have any special powers. Throughout the 1960s, the Chinese organized such sessions in the villages where important religious figures, rich farmers and landlords were forced to confess to having exploited the poor. The Chinese campaign was to reorient Tibetans' thinking to ensure their eventual acceptance of Tibet as an inseparable part of the motherland. By the time of Mao's death in 1976, even the Chinese realized that their rule in Tibet had taken a wrong turn. Mao's successor, Hao Guofeng, decided to soften the government line on Tibet and called for revival of Tibetan customs. In mid-1977, China announced a welcome to the Dalai Lama and other Tibetan refugees. The Panchen Lama was released after a 10-year imprisonment. The Chinese even agreed that a fact-finding commission could be sent to Tibet by the Dalai Lama. The fact-finding mission's conclusions were despairing. For some years, some relaxations were given to the Tibetans. After 1980, they could discard the drab uniform of socialism and revert to traditional clothes. The Dalai Lama's pictures began to reappear on the roads of Lhasa. The years of propaganda and ideological education had made little or no dent in the Tibetan society. They discarded the socialist culture and traditional practices returned with a new vitality. Jokhang Temple opened for 2 days a month starting in 1978. Potala Palace opened in 1980. Then in 1982, a 3-person team from Dharamshala went to Beijing and was told that the Dalai Lama would be given a desk job if he returned, and that Tibet was part of China. By 1983, talks were broken, and the Chinese did not want the Dalai Lama to come. A mass immigration of Chinese started to arrive in Tibet. Attractive salaries and interest-free loans were made available to Chinese willing to emigrate to Tibet, and in 1984 alone, 1 lakh, which is 100,000 Chinese, went there to modernize the backward Tibet. In 1986, the Chinese loosened restrictions on tourism. Western foreigners started coming with their dollars, but they sympathized with the sufferers. And when the monks protested against the communist regime and demanded the return of the Dalai Lama in September 1987, they were beaten, fired upon, and arrested. And this was witnessed by the Western tourists. Communication with the outside world was then broken off. Foreigners were evicted from Lhasa, but eyewitnesses gave their accounts to the newspapers. In March 1988, during the Monlam festival, again there was shooting in Lhasa streets, and in December also the same things were repeated. On the 5th of March in 1989, Lhasa witnessed the largest anti-Chinese demonstrations in the capital since 1959. For 3 days, the Chinese police fought with the Tibetans, and the number of casualties was uncertain. On the 8th of March, martial law was imposed. The wave of unrest which swept across China in July 1989 in the form of the Tiananmen Square incident is known to the whole world. Closed-circuit cameras were installed overlooking Jokang and Barkor in Lhasa, the sites of most demonstrations. In 1999, the Voice of America started Tibetan language broadcast, the subject being the Dalai Lama and Tibet. But still, Western interest in Tibet was not a serious one. In July 1994, to push Tibet towards a market economy, the authorities opened Tibet's first stock exchange in Lhasa. This attracted huge amounts of capital into the region, but it did not benefit the local Tibetans. The chief motive of the economic reforms in Tibet was to accelerate its political integration into China and to modernize the agrarian economy of the region. In April 1996, the Chinese authorities again intensified the campaign against the Dalai Lama and ordered that all religious buildings, shops, hotels, private houses, parks, clubs, etc., to take down the Dalai Lama's photographs, and described him as a political fugitive and not a religious leader. So here comes the question. Why does China want to possess a land that had long been regarded as poor and barren? The answer is that Tibet, a land of vast area and sparse population, is very rich in mineral resources, flora, fauna, and water, not just limited to rivers. China, having the largest population in the world, needs these things, as well as space. Tibet had always escaped annexations by either the Mongols or Imperial China. By converting the leaders of the threatening countries to Buddhism. But now, Mao could be seen to accomplish what all other emperors of China had failed to do, and control the last barbarians of the West. At present, behind the bamboo curtain, what happens is little known. But every cloud has a silver lining, and we can hope for the best by telling everyone who is concerned about the people who have no voice because their human rights are not a concern of any Amnesty International, any nation. Hopefully creating concern in every conscientious human being, because their Buddha is also deep in meditation and not listening to their prayers. So as we've seen, even the minerals of Tibet have been raped by the Chinese. They have left no one. Even the monks and other people in Tibet have gone through untold misery and torture. When did this all start? Well, after the Dalai Lama fled to India, the Chinese were out to destroy monasteries that had not been bombed earlier. They first of all marked out all the learned monks, the teachers, the reincarnate lamas, and the administrators and reserved them for special torture. Under guns, they made the monks break their monasteries, burn scriptures, and melt statues and silver and gold butter lamps into solid metal lumps. The highest highway is Tasawa Pomda at 12,500 feet above sea level in Tibet. In its place was Pomda Monastery, which was turned into a prison in 1961 and had 5,000 prisoners in it. The monks had to pull ploughs by ropes, were made to starve and given dirty food that was not even fit for dogs and pigs. Sometimes they were forced to eat human excreta. After 2 years, only 700 prisoners were alive there. Between Rinpoche and Chamdo, there are several mass graves where the Chinese threw and buried dead as well as live wounded Tibetans. For 9 to 12 hours a day, every day the prisoners had to do hard labor in the mines, building roads, building bridges, in all weathers, without food, without proper clothing, without any sleep. If they fell, they were beaten until they gained consciousness. Despite broken limbs, they had to work. Sometimes, due to frostbite, the flesh of the hands would tear off and stick to the shovels. Still, the Chinese would beat the prisoners, saying they would send them to meet their Buddha. The prisoners were hung upside down in empty rooms and beaten with batons, and were forced to be beaten by their cellmates. Every day they would shoot the prisoners and throw them away. Since 1949 up to 1983, 12,07,487 Tibetans had been killed, but the number increased even after 1983. At night, the dead bodies were taken in lorries in quiet corners between hills and buried there. Sometimes the bodies of monks who died as a result of forced labor or starvation were burnt, and their ashes were thrown on soil as fertilizer. Sometimes the Chinese have even constructed houses on the grave sites. The monks could not even take solace in saying prayers using their rosaries, as the Chinese routinely cut off their thumbs brutally as soon as they were imprisoned to prevent them from using their rosaries. The extent of oppression by the Chinese is always beyond words. If a child was killed, parents were forced to smile and applaud. Otherwise, they too were killed brutally. In jails, women were constantly being raped, and medicines were given to them. You can imagine why. Special hard treatments were given to aristocrats, chieftains, landlords, lamas, and often just anyone who could read. The prisoners underwent obligatory thumbsing criticism sessions, speaking out anything, and then being beaten and tortured. Some monks and others were even sent to remote prisons in deserts of Inner Mongolia with little or no food and in forced labor, building bridges and roads for the Chinese without any pay, without any clothes or medical attention. Naturally, it killed most of them. In the Gobi Desert area in the prisons, water trucks used to come once a week for the officers, and the overflowing water from the sides of the truck was licked by the prisoners. Monks worked in coal mines in darkness with no light, with water at the base. 9 hours a day and were covered with sores and burns with ropes. When the sores got bigger and black at the edges, sometimes beneath the rotting flesh, bones could be seen. The agony of starvation is terrible. The Chinese gave the prisoners practically no food, only sometimes bits of vegetables. A monk who survived reported to a TV journalist that they were always hungry. They sought vegetables from human feces and ate them. Some ate the flesh of rats, dogs, and even the flesh of human beings, corpses. A whole generation of old people died because of starvation and torture. Many people committed suicide so that they may not break under torture. 99,010 prisoners died, according to an estimate. Now, what is Tibet like at the present moment? The general condition of the people in their own country is deplorable. All the valleys and mountains are occupied by the Chinese. They are everywhere, doing business, building things, pushing the Tibetans out of their jobs, off their land, and taking their houses. And now recently it has been known that they are evicting them from their own housings and forcing them to go to their villages from the urban areas. The Chinese have proper houses with electricity, running water, bathrooms, drains, pavements, and trees. There are none of these amenities in Tibetan houses. They are just like pigsties. Sometimes 3 families living in one dirty room with the partitions made of sacks, totally blackened due to the smoke of the hearth. And then the Chinese call the Tibetans dirty barbarians. The Chinese dominate them and make them thoughtless so that they can only think of their survival from one day to another. The Chinese have even changed the time of Tibet and kept it like Beijing, 2,570 miles and 3 time zones away. The Chinese have an innate sense of superiority. Their symbol, a rectangle with a line passing through its middle, shows that the rectangle is the globe and the line slashing it through the middle is China, the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, the most superior beings on the earth. The Manchurians, the Mongols, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, they are all barbarians. And that applies to foreigners too. Because of the transfer of the Chinese to Tibet, the Tibetans have become a minority in their own land. According to a Tibetan, it is worse than a plague of locusts. At least, the locusts move on. Everywhere there are Chinese signs, on the banks, in the shops, restaurants, posters, street names, in the Tibetan quarters, and even inside the temples. If we look at this strategically and objectively, it looks like a long-term plan to eradicate the Tibetans as a race. The same as the Nazis had planned to exterminate the Jews and other undesirable non-Aryans from this earth. Despite the claim of the Chinese that Tibet is a part of China, anthropological studies have established that Tibetans' features, heights, long bone structures, hair, eyes, skin, color, etc., distinguish them as a separate race from the Chinese. China's unhindered exploitation of Tibet's forest reserve has threatened Tibet's ecology. When it comes to contamination of rivers by nuclear dumping or flooding because the ground has no more trees to hold the soil, what happens to the ecology and rivers of Tibet affects not only Tibetans but also millions and millions of people in the rest of Southeast Asia. 6 million Jews were massacred in the Holocaust, and the world has never been allowed to forget it. But more than 1.2 million Tibetans, which is more than 1/6 of the population, have been wiped off the face of the earth, and no nation has done anything to stop it. The UN only passed resolutions saying China has violated their human rights and suppressed the rights of self-determination. No nation broke off relations with China. When trade is involved, all that any nation is concerned with is its balance sheets. All the nations talk of human rights as lip service only when it suits them. The Chinese police have been locking up a whole country from the scrutiny of the world. At present, there are about 2,000 monasteries which have been opened. Some artifacts have been brought back to China and new statues made. Some repairs have been funded only to promote tourism so that the Chinese earn the money. At some places, Tibetans, rather monks, are themselves making the repairs with their meager resources. No single person is ever allowed to travel in Tibet. Only groups can go, and that also guided by Chinese people specially trained on what to talk to the foreigners about. In the Barkho region around the Jokhang temple, there are more than 3,000 beggars and paupers, and China claims its economic prosperity in Tibet. When some foreign delegation has to visit, many days before that, these beggars are sent to other places, or some are locked up behind bars. There is a clean-up campaign going on in Lhasa and other cities on the tourist route because of the Beijing 2008 Olympics. There is such a system called the informer system. Now, there are spies in all communes. The Chinese have organized from the very beginning a highly efficient system of infiltrators that even today is extremely proficient. The spies are everywhere, in the monasteries, among the monks, among the ordinary people, office workers, in all strata of life, even in schools, among school children. Fear of informers permeates the very fabric of lives of the Tibetans. One has to be on his guard 24 hours a day. Once a Tibetan monk said to a TV journalist in Sikkim, and I quote, "Our story is almost impossible to film. Unlike Auschwitz and Belsen, the concentration camps during World War II in Germany, we have no Allied troops to come in and film our walking dead. Our dead are buried. Our physical wounds have healed. No foreigner has been allowed free access to the interiors of Tibet. There are no films, no reports, and no international campaigns. How can you make an uncaring world believe you?" Stephen Corey, Director General of Survival International, an international organization working for the rights of threatened tribal people, reported that the Tibetan situation is, and I quote, "far from providing the poor with enough to eat, the overwhelming evidence suggests that the Chinese totally disrupted an essentially self-sufficient society and caused through their brutality and colonialism massive food shortages and widespread hunger as the masses were put to work to feed their new masters." English-speaking monks in the monasteries may not be monks at all. The Chinese have forced Tibetan girls to marry the Chinese, and it is a tragedy that most of the girls have been forced to adopt the lives of prostitutes in brothels in all the major cities just to survive. The smaller cities are full of them as well. Very often you are able to read in the newspapers that Beijing has been linked to Lhasa by train. Nomads travel by motorbikes and keep mobile phones. That is to say, their lives have changed and that now they have better lifestyles. If you try to understand, going into the depth of the matter, the train facilities are for the Chinese and their troops. Nomads can't keep more animals than a fixed number. They have to pay a fine if the numbers exceeds. The meat, the milk, the butter and the wool of their animals is exported and foreign exchange is earned. Their life becomes more difficult because when there is no more grass in one place, they can't go to some other meadow on their own will. The women working in the hotels are wearing Tibetan dresses, no doubt, but very often they are Chinese and they are forbidden to speak Tibetan language. I have just acquainted you with the torture and agony the Tibetans are undergoing even today, while the world just looks on without even lifting a finger. It is here where you come in, even by just sharing their pain, sharing their sorrow in thought, word, and deed. Thank you.